Hey everyone, I'm Michelle Yeahy, a reporter at the Washington Post and the president of the Asian American Journalists Association. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion on covering the White House as an API journalist. I'm really excited to feature this all-star panel of speakers, some of the most high-profile API journalists covering national news, and some of the journalists I really admire. Historically, the White House press corps has lacked diversity, and at a time when racial reckoning and racism against APIs are at the forefront of our news coverage, it's so important to have API journalists covering such high-profile beats and bringing greater diversity to the press corps. Through their relentless and bold reporting, WEIJIA, SEUNG, David, and AMNA are inspiring our fellow journalists and AAJ members every day. On top of all of their work, they always lend their talent to the AAPI community at large, and they always give back to younger journalists, and I'm so thankful to them for that. I hope you're all just as excited as I am to hear how more journalists can follow their path. I'm so proud to have them in our AAJ family and grateful that they're here with us tonight. And now I would like to introduce the moderator for today's session, PBS NewsHour's senior national correspondent and substitute anchor, NAWAZ.
Hi, everybody. Michelle, thank you so very much for that introduction and those very, very kind words. I am incredibly excited to be able to lead this discussion tonight because I get to hang out and talk with three reporters of whom I am already a huge fan, and we never get to hang out like this. So there's going to be some good chat ahead. I'm going to run through very quick introductions because I want to save a lot of the bio conversation for a little bit later. People will share with you how they got where they are. And also, you already know these folks because we're all big fans. So going around the horn, we have with us Seungmin Kim from the Washington Post. How are you doing, Seungmin?
Good. I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited for this panel.
Excellent. We also have with us David Nakamura, your colleague over at the Washington Post. How are you, David?
I'm doing great. Appreciate it.
Excellent. And also just joining us now after rushing home from filing for the CBS Evening News is WEIJIA JIANG, White House correspondent for CBS News. How are you, WEIJIA?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. I'm excited about this conversation. And I just want to make sure you guys can hear me because the sound is a little jumbled now that I'm home.
We can hear you just fine so far. If we have any issues, we'll jump in with some tech support, but so far so good. So let's jump in because, as I mentioned, when you get a group of journalists together and there's big news on the day, you have to talk about it. And Seungmin, I'm going to start with you because you did tweet about it and you said you have some thoughts. We now have the first Asian American potential vice president on the Democratic ticket. I know a lot of people are claiming her, but what about you? Tell us your thoughts, your reaction to the naming of Kamala Harris as Vice President Biden's running mate.
Well, I think speaking on the political side of things, it's a pretty not a surprising pick. I think she was at the top of every list that we kind of had talked about. She was clearly on the vetting list. I mean, she's clearly one of the top people out there. But I was just really fascinated by the immediate coverage of her as a candidate. Clearly a history-making choice, the first woman of color to be on a national, major party national presidential ticket. So clearly a big moment and a big moment for representation in terms of politics. But I found it really interesting that several major news organizations obviously noted that history in their breaking news alerts and their first cut of the stories by identifying her as the first Black woman. That is true. She is also the first Asian American. She is South Asian. She is Indian. Her mother is Indian and her father is Jamaican, and so it is a big moment for the Asian American community to have representation on a national ticket. But with the and there were many news outlets that handled it right. Obviously, cable TV had mentioned that several times. But I was just looking quickly through the alerts and not all. A lot of major news organizations omitted the Asian part of her heritage, which I thought was really interesting. I think that they're talked a lot of these conventions, a lot of these panels, and a lot of, not just journalist panels, but about politics as well, about how it's difficult to try to it's been difficult to get more coverage of Asian Americans in politics, our kind of electorate's influence on campaigns and politics and policy. So I know this is kind of just kind of another microcosm, another example of that, and I'd be really interested in hearing what the other panelists say.
Yeah, and I do want to mention, we'll talk a lot more about race and representation and how that gets discussed in the general news media in a little bit. But David, what about you? Let's get your reaction.
No, I was going to say, Seungmin makes great points. It also struck me that addressing race and gender and immigration and adding Kamala Harris to the ticket, like as if those weren't enough in the forefront, is going to really promote, sort of promote that conversation and argument, debate, and really make a distinction between the parties and how they view these things. And she exemplifies all of those things at a time that there's real questions about our moral fiber of our country and kind of where we're headed as a country. So to me, it opens up a great opportunity to really delve into these issues. I think it's also interesting, for someone like Joe Biden. He's trying to obviously reach a younger set of voters, establish confidence in his judgment, especially when it comes to minority communities. And Kamala Harris was very forceful in sort of challenging him on some of those things during the Democratic primary. So you already see the Trump campaign trying to sort of pick at this idea that Kamala Harris questioned Joe Biden's credentials on race and criminal justice reform, and that now they're calling her phony or duplicitous for joining the ticket, which is sort of a cheap shot. But at the same time, I think you're going to have a chance for sort of Biden to have to talk about these issues in a way that his vice president may be more willing to sort of talk about it, more comfortable talking about it. So that's going to be interesting for Biden.
WEIJIA, what about you? You've just come from the White House. As David mentioned, they already had a response ad, a response statement ready to go. What do you make about the naming of Senator Harris?
Just to return to the start of this conversation, when Seungmin tweeted about Kamala Harris reminding people that she is in fact half Asian, I think it was just a stark reminder of the platform that we have as journalists and the importance of diversity in our newsroom. It's not, we don't have diversity because we want to be able to say, oh, we all look different from each other. We all bring a different perspective. And certainly this is a huge day for the Asian American community to have this representation on a presidential ticket. And so, it should be really any student of history to point that out. But, of course, those of us who are Asian American are quick to experience that and to recognize those headlines as being only half true. And so, I think that's just a good reminder of why it's so important to have diversity.
It's such a good point, and we will talk more about a lot of those points everybody raised now. Just a quick housekeeping note, too, to everyone out there. I see some of you already putting questions into the chat feature. Feel free to keep putting them in there. We're going to save time at the end of the conversation and get through as many of those as we can, so do follow along. But I don't want to make this like a political analysis conversation. You guys do enough of that every day. We want to hear more about what we don't normally get to hear from y'all. And one of the questions that we get all the time, regardless of whatever panel we're taking part in or discussion we're taking part in on a more personal level, how'd you get where you are? You guys have all set the bar higher for AAPI journalists. You're at the top of your game covering the White House. Let's just go around the horn. Tell us briefly how you got where you are. Seungmin, you want to kick us off?
So the only thing I've wanted to do ever in my life was to be a reporter. So it's kind of the, work on my high school newspaper, worked at my college newspaper, did a bunch of internships, was lucky to go to a place with a very, was lucky to attend a school, University of Iowa, with a very good college paper and really got my education there. And then just kept working at it. So my first job out of college was at the Star Ledger in Newark, New Jersey, which at the time was one of the biggest regional newspapers in the country. And after a year there, I came down here to DC, did a one-year graduate school program at American University, where at the same time I also worked for USA Today and their Washington bureau. So after that year program was done, I got hired on at Politico, which was only 2.5 years old at the time. So just a true baby toddler in the political journalism business, and stayed there covering mostly Congress for about 8.5 years. And then I started at the Washington Post in early 2018 on a beat that focused it's technically a White House reporter, but covers it in a unique way. Just where my specific beat is kind of that intersection between the Trump White House and Capitol Hill. And I think as we see even just today, or even just the last couple of days, with just the personalities and the policy clashes between Capitol Hill and the administration, there is certainly no shortage of stories there.
And WEIJIA, what about you? Was making it to the White House, was that like a goal for you professionally?
No, definitely not. I never had to cover politics. It was never my passion. And in fact, I spent many years in locals because I loved covering communities and really getting to know, different cities and people who lived there and understanding their issues. But my path just kind of evolved pretty naturally. And when I got an opportunity to jump from the local to the national level of reporting, it was for a position in Washington, D.C., right before the 2016 campaign. And so, of course, if you are based in Washington during that time, you're going to be covering the race. And that's when I first started covering politics and, sort of getting the bug. And I realized before, I thought, oh, gosh, what a boring beat. I wanted to cover stories that I thought would have a far-reaching impact on people by sharing stories and really talking to people. And then, of course, now I realize, this is such a critical assignment. And, what we do every day is truly playing a role in informing people at home and having that broad reach that I had hoped for. And I sort of describe, especially covering the Trump White House, because ultimately that job led to this one, as a drug that I didn't know existed. And then all of a sudden I took it, and now I am addicted, and for better or worse. But it is all consuming. And, now, especially at this point in time, I can't imagine covering something else. I mean, I can imagine it, but let me just say there's nothing I'd rather be covering right now.
I like how you at first thought, well, maybe this won't be that exciting. I love that there was a time that we all thought we don't know what's going to come after 2016. David, what about you? You've had a really interesting path to get where you are. Tell us a little bit about how you got.
I want to know what WEIJIA's, what kind of drug she was taking. I mean, it was upper, downer, a hallucinogen. I mean, sometimes I feel that way, honestly, like day to day. Today I was working today before this, I was working on a story about Trump talking about opening sports. He went on a radio show, or a guy named Clay Travis, who's a kind of a shock jock radio host who got famous on CNN a few years ago for talking about his allegiance to the First Amendment and boobs, a direct quote. But Trump went on that radio show and started talking about sports. And it seems like I saw that about 5 o'clock, and it went up a little while later online. Seems like a news cycle ago, given where we are with Biden. I looked up, and it was my worst nightmare because my story is going to get a lot less attention. But that's pretty much what we've come to now on this job, and people recognize the high pace of this. Speaking of sports, I started as a sports reporter mainly because I was a terrible athlete who had no future in the game, and never thought I was going to cover politics. And even when I was offered the position, it surprised me because I hadn't really pursued it. I've been at the Post for many years. My first assignment ever at the White House was when I was an intern. Must have been 1992, I'm dating myself, under George H.W. Bush, and I snuck in to cover the athletes' reception. It was raining outside. They decided to have it inside the White House foyer, and I went over from the press room and snuck in, or went in with the athletes so we could hear George H.W. Bush talk. And then the athletes fanned out to eat hot dogs and hamburgers, and I sort of snuck in the East Room or something, and I was like just holding a pen and pad. They kicked all the reporters out, and I stayed in there to talk to, various athletes who I knew from the Olympics. And finally, I felt this guy's hand on my shoulder, and he said, "I'm Secret Service. You're out of here." And I said, "Well, no. Why? I just got to get a quote." He's like, "No talking." He kicked me right out. Luckily, he didn't kick me out of the whole complex, but he kicked me back to the press room. I didn't return to the White House until 2011, when I started covering the Obama administration. And in between, I've covered local news, education, city government, the taxpayer funding of the Nationals baseball stadium, contamination of lead in DC's tap water, the Tokyo earthquake and nuclear disaster. I went to Afghanistan. So I've covered a lot of different things, but I'm still learning how to do this beat. And I don't really find it like a drug, honestly, especially where we are now. It's difficult sometimes to process what we're seeing and covering, honestly. I used to joke, sports writers always joke that we love sports, and then you become a sports writer and you hate sports. Maybe there's a lot of jobs like that. You see the underbelly, you see the athletes, you see that they don't want to talk to you. You see the money in sports. I mean, obviously I used to joke with Obama, the difference between covering sport. People say, "Oh, sports is similar to covering politics because winner and losers." I said, no one ever. I mean, there's a campaign and someone wins, but nothing ever gets passed through Congress. There's no end to it. Nothing ever, like I covered immigrant. So final thing I used to say is that when I cover the White House, you cover almost everything. And I started covering the 2012 campaign. And I said, if Obama wins re-election, I want to cover some policies really more deeply. So I picked immigration policy because the idea was that the Republicans had lost and they would have to do immigration to open themselves up to a broader electorate. And then I picked Asian policy because Obama was going to do the pivot to Asia. And I went on the first big trip on that in 2011 and traveled with him, and I saw it up close. And so I covered the TPP trade deal and the immigration bill. And of course, nothing ever happened, any of them. They didn't succeed. I mean, that obviously said to where Trump's rise, but so it was important to cover. But it can be frustrating covering this job in where we are in Washington today.
I just love the idea that there was potentially a time when David's mugshot was up in Secret Service office. Don't let this guy in because he was here without authorization.
That wouldn't be the first time. In 2012, my biggest story, as a new reporter on the White House, was I broke the news that there was a Secret Service scandal of prostitutes. The Secret Service hired prostitutes. People probably remember in Colombia. I wasn't on the trip, but I got a call here and a tip, and we ended up breaking the story. So I wrote many, many stories about Secret Service. Later, we'll probably talk a little bit about how we deal with the beat, and I can tell a story about getting kind of doxxed online and piled on by the MAGA world after tweeting a picture of the Secret Service. Pretty much right when the pandemic was becoming a huge deal. I'll save that story for later.
Oh man, okay, save that story. Remind me to come back to it if I don't ask you about it. But I want to talk a little bit about just the function of the job. You're giving us a little bit of insight into that now, David. But WEIJIA, let's start with you on this, because for so many people who follow the White House, one of the most sort of exciting or high profile events, right, that even people who don't normally actually follow detailed news day to day, one of the things they'll absolutely follow and watch a live stream for is the briefing, right? Whether it's the president himself or whether it's the press secretary, hundreds of thousands of people will tune into live streams. We'll make sure they know what happened in that briefing. It's become like a spectacle. It's like a show in and of itself. So give us a little bit of sort of an insider's view to how it's working in that room. A lot of people ask about the White House press corps working together. They ask about the perception that the president seems to be targeting women of color when he tends to get more aggressive with his back and forth. What's your take on that?
I will say that the president does not discriminate when it comes to his attacks. He, goes after plenty of male reporters, white reporters, and I think there's just certain reporters, period, who get under his skin, and that it is a mechanism to deflect, and so our job is to try to stay on course as best as possible, on topic, because I've said this before, at this point in time, our reporting is so critical that it really is a matter of life and death. It's not an exaggeration to say that people are relying on the information that we are bringing to light, on the information that officials are saying from the podium. They're relying on that to make their everyday decisions to try to get through the day and try to get through this pandemic. And so anytime that there is an effort to distract, whether that is, a heated exchange with a reporter or, citing falsehoods, it's our job to, redirect and get back on course. And so there's so much pressure, there's so much preparation that goes into preparing for the briefings. And I think that, the quality of our questions is so important. And so in the room, you're really just thinking about, what has he just said? Has he said anything that conflicts with other data? Is there a question that someone else asked that was really good and left unanswered? It's just a full body experience, because you have to be so plugged in. And, the other, David and Seung-min can both talk about this, because they've been sitting in those chairs as well. And they know what it's like. It's very intense. But again, I think that's just because our responsibility is so heightened at this point in time. And I think it's just incredibly important to be as armed as possible with information heading into each briefing.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? Because I think a lot of people would be curious about what it is you tell yourself in some of those moments, because you mentioned some of the reporters that seem to get under his skin. I think it's fair to put you in that category, even though you are just there asking straight questions. The president has reacted very strongly to you, right? He's back in April was trying to sort of sarcastically soothe you, saying nice and easy, telling you to relax. There was another time he said that you should be ashamed of yourself for the question that you asked. I mean, yes, he does it to other reporters, but he's done it to you. So I'm asking, what is it you tell yourself? You were so calm and so cool and so collected in those moments. What's the inner monologue? Or like right now when you're multitasking.
Well, I have to.
Oh, Robert Kelly moment. There it is.
Hi.
It's going to go viral.
So I am a mom, and so baby.
Oh, it's so planned.
No, that was right on cue. She did a great job.
I got 3 kids. Don't make me one up you.
Bring them out. We'll have a party. I think that, again, the last thing that we ever want to happen, and I think that we actively try to avoid, is becoming the story, because it just takes away from all the other information that is so important, that is way more important than a name that, the president might have called me. And so I think I've just been conditioned to just try my best to follow up and respond with another question. And that question sometimes is about whatever he just said, and trying to provide context about why he answered in the way that he did. For example, during an event about testing, it was my third question of the press conference. Sometimes he does circle back to reporters, and the entire event was about testing. And all, we were hearing was how well the country was doing compared to other countries. And so I wanted to know whether he thought of this as a global competition and why that matters when in the US we are still losing the fight. And that's when he told me to ask China. And so whether I'm interviewing the president or anybody, I want context. I want to understand, why are you pivoting in such a forceful way? Because my question had nothing to do with China. And so that hard turn deserved a follow-up. And that's why I asked, why are you asking me that? And so I think it's just really important to be in the moment and to think about the answer. Sometimes we get so caught up, we don't hear the answer in its entirety, and we just try to think about all the other questions on our list. But sometimes, those questions don't matter, because we're in a conversation, and you have to be able to have that conversation and be able to follow up.
Seung-min, what about you? I mean, when you're in that room, and this is a question I'd really love to hear from you and from David in response to this. It's the idea that you're there as a reporter, you're there reporting on, what the issues of the day are, what the news of the day is, but you're also in there at a time when there is an increase in anti-Asian American sentiment across the country. And when some of that, by many people, is being traced back to the administration. You're a president who continues to call it the China virus, who is not very exact with his words when it comes to these things. What is your strategy? Kind of take us inside what it's like for you in the room.
Well, I think most part, I mean, I totally agree with WEIJIA. Like, keep the focus on the policy, on the substance of the questions that we're asking. But I also, at the same time, and this doesn't apply just inside the briefing room, but in the course of our jobs, I mean, issues like discrimination and racism and sexism, like there are no two sides to those issues. And I think we journalists know what's right, and it's our job to use the platforms that we have, the platforms that we are very privileged to have, to stand up for that when we see discriminatory actions coming from anywhere. So I think that is so that's something that, especially in just the very heated environment we are in these days, that's just something that we always have to kind of keep in our mind. But WEIJIA's right. I mean, I think reporters generally never want to be the news, and we want our reporting to be in the spotlight. So a lot of it is really just kind of being prepared, staying on the president or other administration officials that you're questioning, and just trying to keep focus on the fact that you are the conduit for the public, especially in a very critical time like a pandemic. You are kind of the pathway for the public who has a lot of questions about this administration, a lot of fear that and we are the ones privileged enough to sit in those seats to ask those questions. So it's a lot of preparation, a lot of David and I know, like, whenever there is a presidential press conference or a press secretary briefing, like, we always workshop questions and brainstorm questions amongst our colleagues on the White House team, to the point that we are sharpening questions even down to the word, which was actually something really new to me, kind of joining the White House 2.5 years ago, because so much of my experience had come from Capitol Hill. And of course you prepare, there is a level of preparation when you're when you're interviewing senators and members of Congress on Capitol Hill. But so much of interviewing, reporting in Congress is impromptu. You could turn a corner. You had it planned on seeing a senator today, but you're like, oh, he could actually be of use for a story that I'm working on or that I might work on in the future. So you just kind of go up to him and have a conversation. And then you transition to someplace as high profile as the White House, and just the amount of workshopping, brainstorming, preparation to be able to say, for example, if the President Trump pushes back on a question, to be able to go back in with actual facts and hold him accountable to that. That's been a really, really good and really interesting learning experience for me.
So David, now would be the time. Yeah, no, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I can tell that story in a minute. I mean, just to set the stage briefly, I wanted to say that, when the first time I asked President Obama a question at a news conference, it was in the East Room. It was very formal. Trump tend to be looser, as we know. It was, there's the big East Room is very ornate and grand. It was packed. The TV lights were really bright. When I stood up to take the microphone, part of me was, to some extent nervous of asking the President of the United States a question, but also part of me was very cognizant of being the center of everybody watching. And all I could think of really was other reporters, picking apart my question. And this was in 2011. The stakes have gotten much more extreme, especially right now in the pandemic. There's fewer reporters in the briefing room, which puts more attention on them. And I have not been out of this house since like March 11th. I have not returned to reporting on the ground, which I miss and I wish I could. And I'm losing something. But because I have 3 kids, I made that decision. So, people like WEIJIA who run the front lines, they're exposed more, so to speak. They're maybe hopefully protected from the virus with fewer people in there. But the tension's on them. The stakes are higher given the storyline in the country, the election, the health crisis, the economic crisis. Trump himself is doing these briefings, as we know, and there are bad faith actors in the room. And the White House is happy to go to them when they feel it's necessary. And that makes a problem because as much as we don't want to be the story, we become the story almost no matter what, because there's a big network on Twitter that want to make us the story. And we get criticized from all sides of anything we ask. We're criticized from the left by saying we don't work together enough and respect each other's questions and follow up and press Trump. We get criticized from the right that we're in collusion and we're all trying to make him look bad. From the Obama people were tough on reporters who asked questions. The first question I asked, I was told later from my editors that one of the top White House communications folks was emailing folks in our office that we shouldn't get a question again because of what I had asked, which was about Solyndra and the green energy jobs. There was a big controversy at the time about that company. The next day I went to pick up some credentials for a trip. I turned around and another White House press person was there and really read me the riot act and said that I was so wrong in my question that they had written a blog item on the White House website to shoot me down and shoot all the things down that I'd said. And sure enough, I don't know if that they mentioned me by name, but it didn't address what I had asked more in depth than Obama had. Fast forward, I'll quickly tell the story just because it does actually, in a weird way, deal with race. And certainly I was subjected to, interesting comments online. But, basically in early March, as things were just getting to the point that things were going to be shutting down, I wrote, because I've written a lot about the Secret Service, I wrote a story about the Secret Service role in protecting both President Trump, but also potentially Biden and others from the coronavirus and what level of responsibilities the Secret Service have. That story published online one day. And that day, President Trump went to Capitol Hill and showed up walking down the hallway with the Majority Leader McConnell, and next to him was an Asian man, which I noticed because he happens to be President Trump's, main or number 2 Secret Service agent, and I had seen him on Air Force One, and I had actually inquired about who he was. I was surprised to see, obviously, and honestly, an Asian man. I'd never really seen that in the Secret Service. So I took a screenshot and I tweeted and I circled him and I said, here's Trump arriving at Capitol Hill and here's his Secret Service. I said and I said something like for no, particular reason. And I said that because I was not trying to say that he's Asian or anything, but this was right around the time that, the question of whether Trump was talking about the China virus was just picking up steam. And I got attacked, for both being racially insensitive, in which, Don Jr. and other people in the MAGA world and Trump's orbit suggested I was a liberal reporter who got away with being racist against this Asian guy because I was suggesting that he was going to give Trump the virus, even though I just written a story about how the Secret Service was protecting these folks from the virus. I got also criticized for, outing Secret Service members, even though, there had been many, many photos of Secret Service agents. In the comments and thousands of reactions that I got, I did get a lot of harassment. People looked up photos, my private photos on, Instagram and other places, and were putting it on Twitter, and I got a lot of, threats. And it was a difficult time, and it was interesting too because I was being accused, of basically being racist against an Asian male Secret Service agent. So it was, something to keep in mind that people are acting in bad faith. If you're not clear about your intentions, someone's going to fill in the blanks for you and try to fill the void for you. And so you have to be careful and cognizant that even something that seemed harmless might be taken that way.
Yeah, and I think everyone should know out there, and I'm sure, even though we haven't talked about it, that Seungmin and WEIJIA have experienced this too. Some of that online response, I'll call it kindly, is really terrifying, and it can be very dangerous sometimes. And I think, in particular, women of color, visible women of color, and as you mentioned, David, it's a very high-profile job these days, get a lot of it on a regular basis. But I want to talk for a moment about just the issue of race and how you all do your jobs, because we're at this moment, right, where we're having a national conversation about how we talk about race and how we actually go back and address our historical inequities and our present inequalities. And I've talked to so many of my colleagues of color across different networks, and I've heard this again and again from a lot of our Black colleagues who say, you know what, I cannot separate race and my identity and who I am from the work that I do. It is core to my job as a journalist. And I'd love to hear what you guys think about that. Do you feel the same way, that you bring your whole lived experience, your identity to the job that you do? And where do you draw any lines, if there are any? Seungmin, do you want to start us off on that?
I think that's a really good question. And of course, our kind of everything about us, our upbringings, our backgrounds, our, gender, our everything. It is a core of who we are and the perspective that we bring to a newsroom, which is why having a diverse newsroom is critical, and not just diverse in the racial sense or the gender sense, although those are very, very important, as we know, but in the socioeconomic sense, in where you went to college, where in the country you're from, the fact that I'm Asian, obviously, I look at a world in a different way, or I notice certain things that others may not immediately do, but also the fact that I'm from Iowa also shapes my worldview in many ways. So I think it is our upbringing, our everything about us is, but especially in the core issues of our race and ethnicity. Obviously, you can't divorce that from who we are as journalists and who we are in a newsroom. I think there is a line, and sometimes it is a fine line. Sometimes, obviously, it can get crossed where it can go into advocacy, but I think most journalists are responsible enough, and journalists, including reporters, correspondents, editors, producers, whatnot, are smart enough and nuanced enough to know where the line is crossed when it goes into straight advocacy for a policy view or something that shows clear bias. But incorporating our worldview and adding that to a newsroom and helping that shape news coverage so it can be as expansive and inclusive and diverse and thoughtful as possible. We just need more of that in a newsroom, and I think it's pretty clear that a lot of newsrooms are wrestling with that debate right now. But it's a conversation that and kind of an internal re-examination or internal examination that obviously was overdue and a very important conversation to have.
Do you ever feel like you've had your reporting questioned because of who you are? Like someone accused you of having an agenda?
I mean, everyone accuses me of having an agenda from all sides, but I'm trying to think of a specific example of like, oh, because you're like a woman or you're Asian, like of course you would write this. I'm sure there are some. I can't think of any off the top of my head right now.
There's just too many. I'll blend together after a while.
Maybe too many. But I think most consumers of news, and particularly just most intelligent consumers of news, know that, obviously, it's impossible for anyone to kind of extricate themselves and who they are from their jobs. And it's not just journalism, from like any job. And hopefully we do our jobs. We work hard enough at our jobs every day to make sure that it is the most fair and inclusive and expansive coverage as possible. And we certainly do from our critics when we fall short. But it's a challenge and a really interesting conversation that's happening in newsrooms right now. And I think, we can all agree that it's kind of a re-examination that was long overdue.
WEIJIA, what about you? Tell us a little bit about how over the years of reporting on so many different issues, how do you sort of balance those things? Where do you decide how much of yourself to bring to any one story or any one report?
So I think, part of this awakening that is happening across the country in newsrooms is reevaluating this concept of objectivity. And, I remember early on in my career, I was so obsessed with portraying myself as being objective that I, tried to stay away from focusing too much on stories in the Asian American community, because I was worried that people would then perceive me as an advocate and somebody who only cared about stories, that pertained to people who looked like me. And, so for as long as I can remember, in conversations about journalism and, dating back to school and grad school, and, we're just so preoccupied with objectivity. And the fact is, we're not objective people, because just as we heard, so, greatly laid out, all these components of our background and of where we come from make up who we are. And that's obviously going to shape our perception of the world and whatever we're covering. And more importantly, framing our questions and, what we are seeing from the ground and how we can bring that to light. And so I think, you don't have to necessarily be objective in that sense that you cannot lean into who you are, but you do have to be fair and you do have to be balanced and you do have to be a reporter. I mean, that's what you're doing is, looking at all these pieces and how you can present them in a balanced and fair way. But I've definitely learned to embrace who I am and where I come from. And that includes West Virginia. And, I think it's so important, the point that SEUNG made, that it's not just about where our ancestors are from. It's about how we identify as Americans and what else makes us who we are. And so I think that the fact that we're having these conversations now more than ever, it is so important as we continue to do the work and try to do better and try to, have a better understanding of those communities that we represent.
I love that you shared that. I think so many people can relate to that idea that you sort of hold back a little bit of who you are because you don't want to be seen to be an advocate. And I know I have done that early in my career too. I think it's so important for young journalists to know your voice is valid for all the many reasons that earned you that spot where you are, and that speaking up does not make you an advocate. It just makes you part of the conversation, and we have to be part of that conversation. Before I turn to audience questions, I want to go around the horn and just ask you something that I'd love to hear from any journalist that I respect and admire, which includes all of you guys, which is more broadly speaking, outside of who we are in AAJA, it is just what gets you out of bed every morning? What keeps you going? Why do you love this job so much? Because it's a very tough time to be a journalist in America. And there has to be something that motivates you every day, that keeps you focused and driven. So just really briefly, if you wouldn't mind, because I think this is really illustrative for a lot of people out there too. What is it that's keeping you going? Why do you love what you do so much? David, do you want to start us off?
What gets me up in the morning is the 3 kids that I have who usually wake me up, one of them or the other. What keeps me going? It's funny. I had twins that were born in the summer of 2016, and I was covering President Obama. I didn't cover the campaign so much, either Hillary or Donald Trump, but rather from Obama. And he had big crowds, and it did seem, talking to David Plouffe and others, that Hillary was gonna win. I then stayed on to cover President Trump as my kids were about 4 or 5 months old during the transition. Not sleeping. I have a 7-year-old now who was 3 then. 3 kids under 4. For years I was joking. The first week I remember covering, we have 7 White House reporters at the Post. We have something called Duty Week, where you kind of have to deal with the tweets and stuff. My first week doing that, I was driving my kid across town every morning to school, and I'd have to pull over the car every time Trump tweeted. I wasn't looking. I would try to ignore my phone, honestly. And my colleague's like, "David, it's your turn to do the hot seat." I said, missed the email, and then finally, like the 3rd day of it, Trump called Chuck Schumer crying Chuck, and I was like, I can't not log on that one. And I pulled up in front of the school, no parking zone, dragged my kid. She was crying in because she saw me all agitated. I said, "Trump tweeted, Daddy's got to do this. Daddy's got to." And I went. And she was crying. And the teacher said, "I'll take her." And I was like, "I got to write. Trump tweeted." And I went to the car and pulled around the side and double parked and got my air card out and wrote, Trump unloaded, on a fellow New Yorker, Chuck Schumer called him trying Chuck, a signal that they're not gonna have a great relationship. And from that day on, I was saying how unhealthy this life can be. We're all as a country going through so much in terms of sort of our struggle, what kind of country we are, where we're headed, and our political morass. On top of that, the pace of covering Donald Trump and the White House and the attention can be draining and difficult. And on top of that, I was like sleeping every night on my kid's floor. I would get up at 3 a.m., wake up on the floor, and then look at my phone. It's like, do I check? And I would check the phone, and I'd see the tweets and the beefs, and it started my day. I couldn't go back to sleep. But obviously the story is so important. There's 3 things going on right now. We know that with the health crisis, and the election, the economic crisis that are just probably the biggest stories any of us could ever cover if they were happening on their own, much less in a single year. And so, like all of it, I think, telling the story is a once in a lifetime opportunity. And that's what really keeps me going.
I just have an image of you delivering that message to your child. Don't tweet it. Daddy's got to go. It's going to be ingrained somewhere in her brain. It's a story she will tell her friends.
She does.
Years from
I think
now.
she has a little bit of a thing when Trump tweets.
We're going to unpack that in another session. I do want to hear from the other panelists too, and I promised you we're going to get to the Q&A. We've got a bunch of questions coming in. WEIJIA, you're a mom too. You're pulling multiple duty between work, demanding home life. What is it that keeps you going every day?
I think I touched on this before, but I just have this weight and this real sense of responsibility to just try to get out the most, the newest, the most important, the most accurate information that we have as this pandemic and this virus continues to evolve. And it is so exhausting. And I haven't covered another president in this capacity, so I don't really have a frame of reference. It is my normal. And I think those of us who have covered Trump from the beginning, we're just conditioned to be able to handle this pace. But the one difference is that now we are living the story too. And so I am a mom and I am a daughter and I have family in China and I have friends here. And so, we're all just trying to get through it together. And I am going through the same thing as people at home. I have the same concerns and worries, and I have the same heartaches to deal with. In fact, one of my beloved colleagues and friends who was a dear friend to AJA, Maria Mercader, she lost the battle to COVID-19. And for me, that, just shattered my whole world and really put into perspective how every single day we have this chance to tell people what's going on and to tell them what they need to know to protect themselves and protect their loved ones and to try to understand how we can, deal with this together. And so when I think about all the things that, we have the privilege of sharing with people at home who rely on us, that gets me out of bed. And it also keeps me awake at night because if I know I'm going to have an opportunity to ask questions and to really get some answers, many nights I've stayed up thinking about what are we missing and what do people need to know. And so I think just being human and again, leaning into those experiences rather than trying to run from that in order to be objective, but really embracing that and going through this experience with everybody actually enriches our reporting.
Sungmin, what about you?
I'll just make it really quick. To be very honest, like I said earlier, I've always wanted to be a reporter since I was like 12 years old. And as stressful as it is, as draining as it is, as taxing it is on your mental health, physical health, and how grinding it can be, it's still very fun and it's exciting. And it is a true privilege to be, literally, this is such a cheesy phrase, it can be overused, but you really are at the front row of these historical moments. And to have the opportunity to cover anything, but particularly Washington at this time, from Capitol Hill, from the White House, is truly an opportunity that I, thought I would never get. And that is what kind of drives you, what drives you in the morning when you are really tired. I also just, I like finding things out and telling people about them and hopefully being the first person to tell people about what I find out. And that part of the job is really actually fun. You get a big adrenaline rush. And there are other moments too, there is that feeling of awe and just this kind of like, what am I doing here feeling when you like board Air Force One or see the beautiful Capitol and know you have the privilege of just walking around and talking to the most powerful people in U.S. government. And that's what, all those things, as hard as it is sometimes, that's what kind of keeps me going.
You guys are the best. Seriously. I'm so glad this is being recorded because I want to go back and listen to all of this on the days that I need some extra motivation. Okay, I promise there's time for audience questions. I'm just going to try to get through a couple of these and have maybe just one person answer so we have time. WEIJIA, let's put this first question to you. Someone out there wants to know, how do you balance policy questions that may not be easily answered in a formal White House briefing setting versus questions on the news of the day that can be more readily responded to?
Again, it's a game time decision, and it really depends on what else has been asked, and it depends on what the president comes out saying. You know, he begins these briefings with prepared remarks. Sometimes he makes news, and that's, you know, what I mean, that you can't be so married to your list of questions that you aren't willing to break from that and really focus on what he has just said, or another question that has gone unanswered. But honestly, it is a split-second decision, and sometimes I'll go back and think, gosh, did I waste a question? Should I have asked this instead? But you can't doubt yourself. You have to have that confidence and know that there's so much to ask that you're moving the needle in some way or another. But it also depends on what that news of the day is. It depends on what you know, is unanswered in terms of the policy. And so again, it's just this calculation, not to mention the mood of the room, that all goes into what you say when you're called on, if you're called on.
It's a dynamic environment for sure. David, this is a good one for you, given your history of different relationships with different White House officials and your run-ins there. Someone wants to know, how do you build a relationship with White House officials in an administration that's generally hostile to the media?
It's interesting. You know, over the course of my career, I've had situations where I've covered topics and had sources that were a bit, maybe others can relate to this, but they are a bit insensitive about like race or other things. And you know, and then you how much do you confront them, and how much do you try to develop them as a source if you know you don't necessarily personally agree with their point of view, not necessarily politics, but just some of the things they're saying. And you know, from early on, I remember covering something because I mentioned I covered immigration and Asian affairs even under Obama. Kept that going under President Trump. I remember in the transition, I wrote a story that ran on the front page about that Trump was not just interested in dealing with limiting illegal immigration, but also legal immigration. And I was dealing with Stephen Miller, among others, who, you know, talked to me for the story. And then, you know, when the story basically in the first couple of paragraphs suggested that, you know, that this position that Trump had was, you know, racist, potentially racist and xenophobic in the way that, you know, our immigration history has generally seen it. And I remember getting a call as soon as the story hit the web from someone who, you know, basically was calling. And I said, you know, I was used to the Obama folks pretty much calling and challenging parts of the story immediately. And I said, here we go. And it was somebody at the White House. And I said, what's going on? And they're like, well, I saw the story. And I'm like, okay. And I was getting ready for it. Like, what facts are they going to challenge? What? And instead they were like, everything will look fine. But just, you know, if you could just make Stephen Miller's title a little bit more senior. You know, I think he's kind of underplayed. He's actually super senior, you know, White House correspondent, White House advisor. And you know, it just struck me that it's a different era, and you know that the things we're going to talk about. So, you know, it's not easy. Not everybody at the White House has the point of view of the president necessarily about dealing with the media. Some have been more, you know, from Sean Spicer and others over time have been more establishment figures who understand us and have dealt with us in the past, Kellyanne Conway and others. But they're at times they're obviously performing for the president, and so you have to understand that when you're dealing with them.
Shangman, this is a good question for you because you mentioned earlier, you know, there's no two sides to issues like racism and sexism. So this is a question I think a lot of journalists are struggling with right now. Someone's asking, in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and the pandemic, can a journalist also be an advocate for social justice? What do you think?
I think just being a journalist at heart, just like hearing the word advocate, no matter what's surrounding it or the context, I always just kind of like cringe a little bit, because ultimately at the end of the day, I just believe that other journalists, like, we are advocates for the truth first and foremost. And you have to keep all those you have to keep all those issues in mind. You know, there are obviously no two sides to racism, discrimination. But at the end of the day, what you are doing is just trying to present the best, most complete, most fair set of facts and context and information to your public. So it's the word advocate that kind of like it's hard to deal with, particularly in our positions. I've gotten asked kind of at other places, kind of well before all the upheavals of this year, how you kind of divorce your personal feelings on a policy matter or whatnot from your reporting. Because I think obviously we have our own personal opinions on, certain things. We're all human. We have things that we have certain preferences about how the world should be. And I think that's completely normal and human. But for me, it's always been that nothing drives me more, nothing motivates me more, nothing, no cause or whatnot is more important to me than making sure the public gets the best information, the most accurate information, the truth, the most complete set of information, so the public can go out there and make their own sets of decisions, whether it's through voting, through action, through other actions of being involved in their community. And I think that's what, if there was ever a time for journalists to attach the word advocate to our job, perhaps it'd be in that context. I mean, that's kind of a hard word, I think, for journalists to grapple with at times, but I think that should be sort of kind of how personally, I think that's how I approach my job, and hope I live up to that every day.
Advocates for the truth. I like that. Something we can all get behind. Okay, we just have a few minutes left. I really briefly want to make sure we get a chance to hear from each of you on this, because I know so many people out there look up to y'all, and you probably get asked this all the time. But if you had one piece of advice just to offer to young journalists out there who are looking to get their first step into the industry or looking to carve their path, what is that one piece? Either something someone has told you or something that you think it's really important for people to know right now. And Seung-min, since we just ended with you, why don't you kick us off?
The one thing that you can control is how hard you work. I've kind of thought that, I'm never going to be like the most beautiful poetic writer on staff. I'm never going to be like one of the biggest scoop artists, but no matter how young you are, no matter what your level is, what your role is in a newsroom, you can always control how hard you work. And that kind of philosophy, hopefully, has gotten me decently far in life.
Absolutely, you're killing it. Are you kidding? David, what about you? What's your one piece of advice for folks out there?
Sorry. This sort of along the same lines. I'd say, to follow this for sure early in my career and try to still do it, even though I'm getting more older and more tired. But never turn down a story. Really, if you can jump at stuff. One of the biggest stories of my career came through like a cold call, phone call, that there might have been a house with DC tap water that had high levels of lead contamination. It led to a huge scandal that led to months and months of stories and really changed a lot in DC government. And I always remember that. I'd been told on the phone that other people didn't want to deal with the call. So never turn down a story. You never know what you're going to get out of it.
I think my biggest takeaway too is that David needs sleep. Send help. David needs sleep. WEIJIA, what about you? Leave us with some brilliance here. What do people out there need to know?
So this is along the same lines, and so I think that hopefully, especially if you're a young journalist, you're listening, and my advice is to stop looking for shortcuts. I talk to people all the time starting out in their career, and they're so obsessed with how they can get to a certain place as quickly as possible. And that's really not the route you want to take, because you have to have room and space to grow and to make mistakes. You don't want to do that at the level where you want to end up. And so instead, look for the best opportunities to help you build that path to where you want to end up, rather than the lightning fast way to get there, because you have to put in the work. And so someone once told me, be the last to leave and the first to arrive. And, after a few years in your career, that'll change, but definitely if you're starting out, I endorse that. I mean, do the work. Stop looking for ways to not do it. Just do it. And one more thing is to speak up for your work. One mistake that I think I made was because the way I was raised, I was told from a very young age that if you just do the work, it'll speak for itself. And that's not true. If not the right people are seeing your work and paying attention to it, how will they know? So you cannot be afraid to be your own cheerleader. And it does make me cringe still to this day to go and try to do that for yourself, but you have to, because if you're not doing it, nobody else will.
So much yes. All of the yeses to everything you guys just said. I cannot thank you guys enough for taking the time at the end of what was already a very busy day for all of you and taking time away from your families too to have this conversation. I am so grateful for it. And it was just a pleasure to be able to hang out with y'all and talk about this tonight. So thank you very much to WEIJIA Zhang from CBS News, Seungmin Kim from the Washington Post, David Nakamura also from the Washington Post. I so appreciate you and your time. Thank you to everyone out there for watching, sending in your questions. And I just want to point you ahead to another plenary session on Thursday. That's going to be another conversation on reporting while Asian American, this one on the power of the AAPI vote. That is Thursday, right back here at 7 o'clock Eastern. So for now, I'll say goodbye. I'm AMNA NAWAZ, and thank you so much for being with us tonight.